You didn't choose your personality. It was installed before you were old enough to know what a choice was. Not by fate, not by accident. By a specific sequence of events, interactions, responses, silences, presences, absences, that happened to you in a window of time so early that you carry no conscious memory of it. And yet it runs underneath everything. Your relationship patterns, your emotional reflexes, the way you respond to conflict and criticism and intimacy and loss, the version of yourself that appears under pressure. All of it built in a period you can't remember, by people who didn't know they were building it, using materials you never got to inspect. This is the investigation into when your personality was created. Not who you are, when. And the answer is going to be more specific and more unsettling than you expect. Let's begin with the crime scene. Developmental psychology has spent over a century trying to answer one foundational question. Where does a person come from? Not physically, psychologically. What makes you the specific configuration of tendencies and responses and emotional patterns that you are, and not someone else? And the further researchers looked back into human development, the more precisely they located the answer. Not in adolescence, not in early childhood as a broad category, but in a window so early it borders on the invisible. John Bowlby, a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst whose foundational work on attachment theory began in the 1950s and evolved over the following 4 decades, identified what he called a critical period. A window primarily within the first 2.5 years of life, during which the bond formed between an infant and their primary caregiver doesn't just shape emotional development, it creates something Bowlby called the internal working model. Here's what the internal working model actually is. It's not a memory, it's a cognitive template, a framework built from thousands of early interactions that generates predictions about how the world and the people in it will behave. Whether reaching out for comfort will result in comfort being given. Whether expressing need will produce response or withdrawal. Whether closeness is safe or dangerous. Whether other people are reliable or unpredictable. Whether you yourself are worthy of care or fundamentally too much, too needy, too sensitive, too something, to be fully accepted. The internal working model is built before you have language to describe it. Before you have the cognitive architecture to evaluate or question it. It's built from pure experience, the direct, pre-verbal, neurological encoding of what repeatedly happened when you were most vulnerable and most dependent. And once built, it doesn't sit passively in your history. It runs, continuously, as a background operating system shaping every subsequent relationship, every emotional response, every interpretation of ambiguous social information. Here's the detail that changes everything. You're not aware it's running. It doesn't announce its presence. It doesn't label itself as a childhood template. It presents itself as reality, as the accurate, obvious, natural way that relationships work and people behave and the world operates. When someone who built an insecure internal working model encounters a new relationship and feels the familiar pull of anxiety, they don't think, my early attachment template is generating a predictive error signal. They think, there's something wrong with this relationship, or there's something wrong with me. The template is so foundational, so prior to conscious experience, that it feels like perception rather than interpretation. Like seeing the world as it is, rather than seeing it through a filter installed before you could have chosen one. Now let's go into the laboratory, because in 1969, a developmental psychologist named Mary Ainsworth devised an experiment that made Bowlby's theoretical framework visible. The procedure is called the strange situation, and what it revealed about the architecture of early attachment and its consequences is one of the most replicated findings in developmental psychology. The setup is simple. A mother and a 12 to 18-month-old child enter a room. They play. Then a stranger enters. Then the mother leaves, briefly for a few minutes, and the child is alone with the stranger. Then the mother returns. Ainsworth wasn't measuring how much the child cried when the mother left. She was measuring what happened when the mother came back. Because the reunion behavior, how the child responded to the return of the attachment figure after a brief absence, turned out to be a precise diagnostic window into the child's internal working model. Children with secure attachment, whose early experience had consistently taught them that reaching out for comfort produced comfort, approached the returning mother, made contact, allowed themselves to be soothed, and then, reassured, returned to play. The internal working model said, "This person is reliable. Temporary absence doesn't mean abandonment. I can settle because the system works." Children with anxious ambivalent attachment, whose caregiving had been inconsistent, responsive sometimes and unpredictable other times, responded very differently. They cried loudly when the mother left. But when she returned, they didn't settle. They clung and pushed away simultaneously. They couldn't be comforted by the very person they were reaching toward. The internal working model said, "This person comes and goes without pattern. I can't predict when the availability will end, so I can never fully trust that this moment of safety is real." Children with avoidant attachment, whose early experience had taught them that expressing need produced distance rather than connection, showed the response that Ainsworth found most disturbing. They didn't cry when the mother left. When she returned, they didn't approach her. They continued playing as though nothing significant had happened. But physiological measures, cortisol levels, heart rate, showed their stress response was running at the same level as the children who were openly distressed. They had learned, before their first birthday, that displaying emotional need created more distance rather than less. So they stopped displaying it. Not because they felt nothing, because they'd already been trained out of asking. The fourth category, disorganized attachment, appeared in children whose early caregiving had been itself a source of fear. They had no coherent strategy, because the person who was supposed to be the safe base was also the threat. Their reunion behavior was fragmented, contradictory, seemingly purposeless. The internal working model had no reliable framework to offer. Here's the open loop you need to hold. Ainsworth's findings would have been historically significant if the attachment styles had remained only descriptions of infant behavior. What made them revolutionary, what turned developmental psychology in a direction from which it hasn't returned, was the follow-up research. The discovery that the attachment style observed at 12 to 18 months predicted, with documented consistency, patterns of behavior, relationship dynamics, and emotional regulation strategies decades later. Research by Hazan and Shaver, published in 1987, found that adult romantic attachment styles directly mapped onto the infant attachment categories Ainsworth had identified. Securely attached adults, those whose early experience had built a model of relationships as reliable, formed relationships characterized by what the research described as greater longevity, trust, commitment, and interdependence. Anxiously attached adults, those built around unpredictability, showed heightened sensitivity to rejection signals and greater difficulty trusting that connection was stable. Avoidantly attached adults showed consistent patterns of emotional distancing and discomfort with intimacy, even when consciously they reported wanting closeness. The same architecture, built before age 2, running at 35. But here's where the investigation gets darker. In 1995, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, working with Kaiser Permanente, began one of the largest investigations into childhood experience and adult outcomes ever conducted. They surveyed more than 17,000 adults, middle-class Americans, predominantly white, predominantly college-educated, patients of Kaiser's San Diego health system, about 10 categories of adverse childhood experience: abuse, physical, emotional, sexual; neglect, physical, emotional, household dysfunction, domestic violence, parental substance abuse, mental illness in the household, parental separation, or incarceration. The study, led by Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Ander and published in 1998, found something that changed how medicine and psychology understood the relationship between childhood and adult life. More than half of the study participants reported at least one adverse childhood experience. Nearly a quarter reported 3 or more. And the dose-response relationship, the correlation between the number of ACEs and adult health outcomes, was the most consistent finding the researchers encountered. For each additional ACE, risk rose. For 4 or more, a 4 to 12 times higher likelihood of developing alcohol or drug abuse problems compared to those with no ACEs. 2 to 4 times higher likelihood of depression. A dramatically elevated risk of suicide attempts, heart disease, stroke, cancer, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The body keeping score of what the childhood experienced. Not metaphorically, physiologically. The adverse experiences in the first years of life were appearing as disease states in the body 50 years later. Felitti described his core finding in terms that stripped away every comfortable assumption about the relationship between childhood and adult life. He said the childhood experiences were not the past, they were the present, embedded in the biology of the adult who had lived them. But here is where the science takes the turn that nobody expected when Bowlby first proposed his theory, or Ainsworth ran her strange situation, or Felitti began collecting his surveys. Epigenetics. The word means, literally, above genetics. It describes the mechanism by which environmental experience, including early childhood experience, doesn't just shape behavior and psychology. It alters the way genes are expressed. Not by changing the DNA sequence itself, but by adding or removing what researchers call epigenetic marks, chemical tags that determine which genes in a cell are active and which are silenced. Research emerging through the 2000s and 2010s, including foundational work by Michael Meany and Moshe Schiff at McGill University, found that early childhood experience, specifically the quality of caregiving, produced measurable, lasting epigenetic changes in genes related to stress response. In studies with rats, pups that received consistent, attentive maternal care showed different patterns of gene expression in stress response pathways compared to pups that received inconsistent care. The difference persisted into adulthood. And when the researchers cross-fostered pups, giving high-care environment pups to low-care mothers and vice versa, the outcomes followed the caregiving environment, not the biological parentage. Your biology was being written by the quality of care you received, before you had words for what care meant. This is what the investigation has been building toward, not a diagnosis, not a blame assignment, a specific, documented, multidisciplinary scientific picture of how personality, the tendencies, the emotional patterns, the relational strategies, the stress responses that you experience as simply who you are, was substantially constructed in a period beginning at birth and consolidating by approximately age 5, through mechanisms that operated below the level of consciousness and left marks in your biology that are still present in your cells today. The day your personality was created wasn't a single day. It was thousands of days, the first of which you will never remember. But the architecture it built is what you've been living inside ever since. Here's where you need the reality check, because the investigation that reveals how personality is built also reveals how it can be rebuilt. The same epigenetic mechanisms that write early experience into gene expression can be modified by later experience. This is not wishful thinking. It's the same science extended further. Meany's team found that even in adult rats, enriched environments, complex, stimulating, socially safe conditions, produced epigenetic changes that moved gene expression toward the patterns seen in high-care environment animals. The biological marks of early adversity could be partially rewritten by sustained later experience. In human research, this mechanism is what underlies the consistent finding that secure attachment relationships in adulthood, with partners, with therapists, with mentors, with anyone who provides consistent, attuned, reliable care, can gradually update the internal working model. Not erase it, not replace it instantly, but provide new data that the model, which was built to update from experience, can eventually incorporate. Bowlby called this the revising function. The internal working model isn't fixed. It was built from experience. It can, given sufficient and different experience, be rebuilt. The process is slower than the original construction, because the original construction happened during the critical period, when the brain's plasticity was at its highest, and the templates being built were being encoded at a biological depth that adult learning doesn't reach as quickly. But the direction of change is available. The attachment style you walk around with today isn't destiny. It's default. The difference matters. You didn't choose the internal working model you were given. You didn't choose the early experiences that built your stress response, or the attachment patterns that now run underneath your adult relationships, or the epigenetic marks that your earliest caregiving left in your DNA expression. None of it was your decision. All of it happened before you had the cognitive architecture to decide anything. But you are the first person in this lineage with the tools to understand what was built and why, and with access to the knowledge, the relationships, and the sustained experience of being treated differently that can begin, gradually and imperfectly and over a longer timeline than anyone wants, to update the model. We started with a personality that was installed before you knew what a choice was. Here's what the science ultimately says about that. Knowing that it was installed, knowing when, knowing how, knowing what it's made of, is the beginning of having, for the first time, the option to do something about it. You can't choose your origins. You can, with the right information and the right conditions, choose what comes next. The investigation doesn't end here. It starts here.